Good evening. Welcome to the Pandemic Podcast with me, Dan Astin-Gregory. If I sound a little hoarse or under the weather today, that's because I probably have COVID. That's right. Having challenged the restrictions and the policy over the last however many months, here I am having my first personal taste, I believe, of the virus itself, the much feared SARS-CoV-2. So I thought I'd take the opportunity, although I should be resting, no doubt, to take a little tour through the experience so far and dissect this thing, given the vast fear-mongering that we've come to witness over the last 12 to 18 months, where people have become absolutely petrified of this virus. Whilst it's early days, I feel like I have a mild cold. Now, of course, just to be clear, because I feel like I have to add disclaimers to everything now, particularly after I got deplatformed from YouTube on Friday, but that's another story which I'll tell as part of this episode. But the disclaimer in this instance is not to take away from the fact that people have had severe instances of COVID-19 and people have sadly lost their lives. What I'm about to say is not to deny anyone else's experience of the disease or the virus, but it is hopefully going to recontextualize for some who haven't come into contact with anyone who's had the virus or not had it themselves, because we've been told a story of this devastating, non-discriminatory virus that is a deadly threat to all. Well, we know from very early on that that's not been the case. And in fact, my own lack of fear around the situation was informed by the early data out of China, whereby I made a decision very early on that I wouldn't be concerned about contracting this virus. I was very confident that my body would be able to deal with this. And we've seen in the data as well that the vast majority of cases are indeed either asymptomatic or very mild. But people have been made so afraid of this thing that they are literally petrified of catching it. So I hope to bring a little context to the virus. I'm only 24 hours in, but I'll talk you through the experience so far, and then I'll talk to you a little bit about the censorship issues that I faced from Friday's impassioned political speech, I would say, rather than scientific. So over the weekend, I felt a little bit fatigued. For those of you who are regular followers of the podcast, you know I push myself pretty hard, not only to deliver for the podcast, but working on many different initiatives to tackle many of the issues that we're facing right now, putting in long hours. And with a baby on the way, I'm particularly working really hard now to make sure that I have some space post the birth of my son. So putting in the time now, at least trying to. But as always, when you push yourself too hard, it comes at a trade-off, and it results in fatigue and potentially illness, and that can happen any time of year. And those of us who have worked hard for long periods of time will know it often results in colds and things like that. So I'm not at all surprised, having worked exceptionally hard for the past few months in a very stressful environment, both internally and externally, around what we're facing right now. Level of kind of mental tolerance required to take on the topics that we're delivering, that we're focused here on the Pandemic Podcast, takes quite some resilience, mental fortitude. So that, coupled with working 10, 12, 14 hours a day, is probably not helped. But I didn't think anything of it over the weekend when I first started feeling fatigued. I thought, well, I've busted a gut this week. Spent Saturday working on the house to try and get some of the final bits done before the baby arrives. So I didn't really think anything of it. But then really did feel tired last night before bed, exceptionally tired in a way that I hadn't felt for a long time. And I pushed myself pretty hard, pretty frequently. So I get to understand, my body. So I knew that something wasn't right last night. I felt like I had to go to bed at 8 o'clock. And I only ever feel like that when I'm not well. I am, as you witnessed me on the podcast, I'd be quite animated. I can be quite energetic. It's not a persona for the podcast. I consider myself to be a high vibe, high energy kind of guy. But last night I was wiped out, 8 o'clock, just wanted to go to bed. But then woke up in the night, with a fever, high temperature, and what began after that was just an entire night of hot, cold, the classic fever symptoms of just being really, really hot and then really shivering cold. And that lasted pretty much all of the night, or at least felt like it. It's one of those things when it happens during the night. It's probably only for a matter of hours or less than that. But it's when something disturbs your sleep, it feels like it's the entire night. But woke up this morning feeling a little bit under the weather. I would say no more than a mild cold, a sense of a mild cold. And several of my friends who have recently tested positive for this virus or had COVID-19, several people in the community, in the movement actually, that we kind of operate within here, challenging the different policies, all said the same thing, as it felt like a very mild cold, which is an interesting piece, because up till now, we've not really seen those cold-like symptoms associated with COVID. It's been much more of a respiratory, persistent cough, et cetera, high temperature and loss of taste and smell. But we're now seeing, accordingly with the Delta variant, we're seeing, apparently at least, more cold-like symptoms. But that makes me quite skeptical, because whilst I appreciate that the variant itself is an adaptation from a prior variant, we all know from studying the variants that the progression is very mild in terms of the volume of changes. So to actually see some systemic changes in the symptoms is quite peculiar, but certainly not extraordinary. The symptoms have evolved over time. But it certainly felt like a mild cold today, bunged up, kind of headache, fatigue, fever has been on and off. It will just come, it will go. But generally, it's been no worse than a mild cold so far. The telltale sign was the loss of smell. Now, I've had colds before, and I've had some pretty bad man colds before, where, it feels like flu, but it's actually just a cold. I've had a history of autoimmune conditions, so I've always, when I get sick, I usually get it pretty bad, including colds and things like that. So I've had some pretty bad colds in the past where I've also experienced a loss of taste and smell, but which we're often, we've seen this symptom prescribed as a loss of taste and smell for COVID, and almost at the detriment of the fact that, it's almost dismissed the fact that you get that with colds, which you do. But it was a very telltale sign when I was making lunch today, that what I was preparing, cooking, would definitely come with a notable scent. And I suddenly said to my wife, Lizzie, I said, can you smell what I'm cooking? She was like, yeah, of course. I was like, I can't smell a thing. Nothing at all. Quite bizarre. Nothing. So that was a telltale sign. Nonetheless, I could just be having a cold, but the fever and the lack of smell is probably indicative of COVID. And if it is COVID, then I have been trying pretty hard to obtain immunity naturally. I've socialized pretty frequently throughout this entire thing. I've been to many protests, although we know the protests, despite the kind of fear that people have around people mingling at protests, outdoor transmission is virtually zero. So even if I hug hundreds of people at a protest, which I have been doing, I'd never come back with any sign of sickness. So it could be a cold, could be COVID, but in many ways, I'd be very grateful if it is COVID, so that I can just get the immunity and move on. Because whilst I believe anyone's medical choices, their own private matters, I've spoken very vocally about my concerns around the medical interventions, which I can't speak too vocally about this time because I've just been censored for mentioning the words, let alone really going into any detail. And accordingly, I would prefer to allow nature to take its course, because as I mentioned, having studied the data from pretty much day dot, having looked at it as early as February last year when my wife and I flew out to Thailand for our honeymoon, going into Asia at that point where the virus is starting to take effect, I did quite a bit of intense research and came to realize this is really a virus that predominantly affects the elderly and those with pre-existing comorbidities. Now, I'm in my mid-30s and generally healthy. In fact, I consider myself to be very healthy on the scale. take good care of my fitness and nutrition, mindfulness, etc., to preserve my own well-being. So never felt concerned about getting COVID. And if this is COVID right now, then I'm pretty confident my body's going to turn it around pretty quickly. I've got my natural whiskey here. I'm not drinking alcohol at present. My wife is pregnant, so she's clearly not drinking alcohol. So I said I'd do the journey with her. I may never go back to alcohol. The clarity of mind has been exceptional, having no alcohol for the last however many months, since the beginning of this year. But I have Nature's Whiskey here, which is a dose of apple cider vinegar, water, ginger, honey, and lemon, which is my go-to whenever I get any form of cold or flu-like symptoms. And of course, I'm dosing up on vitamin C. You can probably see a big vat of it there behind me on the shelf. And just doing the usual thing. You know, for me, the message throughout this pandemic has been, or throughout this response to COVID-19 has been that, you know, if you're unwell for any reason, just rest, recover, and go back to society when you're well. This should be culturally, how we live. You know, if you get sick, you rest, you recover, and you get back to life once you're back to fitness. You know, we live in a culture, such a fast-paced culture where people don't take time off work. If they're sick, they're expected to go into the office. Now, fortunately, you know, I've been self-employed since 2012, so I don't have those pressures. But many people do, and I think one of the things that could come from this, I hope, is a more, you would hope at least, a greater emphasis on taking care of our own health, And in this situation, when you're sick, just take time off, recover, get well, and get back on it when you're good to go. So I'll be just using my usual protocols, eating plenty of fruits and vegetables. I'll be taking my vitamins. I'll be resting. I'll be having my Nature's Whiskey. And when I've recovered, as always, I will just get back to life. There's plenty going on. So I will keep the audience updated over the coming days if anything changes. But so far, so good. Feels like a very mild cold. And I think it's really important that we actually start to share these experiences. You know, we are seeing a bizarre kind of rise in these kind of summer respiratory viruses, whether that's colds, COVID, or RSV. But it's only bizarre because the lockdowns have essentially kicked the can down the road, where we've stopped people from circulating, and therefore, when they do finally circulate, they get sick. And for me personally, having whether a mild case of coronavirus or a cold, it's a small price to pay for liberty, right? I'd quite happily get sick for a couple of days in order to preserve our liberties. Now, again, disclaimer, I do recognize that there are some who are at greater risk of COVID. That is also true of influenza and other forms of illness. And we have to be smart about how we tackle viruses and not fall into this fatalistic, fear-based track and trace control system where we want to wrap ourselves in cotton wool and become afraid of being sick. You know, I think people have had an easy ride because they haven't been mingling in society. Therefore, you know, things like colds and influenza have dropped during those periods. But then when we start to mingle again, they rapidly rise. You can't avoid it. So we have to recognize we're not infallible. But we do also have to recognize, and again, the data very clearly shows this, there is a distinct link, and I shared a paper on this just a couple of weeks back. There's a distinct link between your underlying health and the severity of COVID-19. And again, I consider myself to be reasonably healthy. I'm not as fit and strong as I was in my late 20s when I was absolutely militant about my training and my calorie counting and eating greens with every meal of the day. I've got a much more of an overall balance now, although I do have a strong desire now. I've got a baby on the way to get back to that level of absolute intensity with my diet and fitness, to get the kind of late 20s fitness back, because I was a machine for a while. Really enjoyed being that fit. But you know, I think if we all invest in our health, then everyone benefits. And I truly believe in the power of natural immunity. we're entering into a culture where the idea of natural immunity is being poo-pooed, it's being dismissed. T-cell immunity is being laughed at. It's just a joke what the situation we find ourselves in, how we can't take natural immunity as an actual course of action. So I do hope that I do have COVID, so that I do get a natural immune response to this thing without medical intervention, which I have no inclination in taking. So that's that. I'll keep you informed. Either way, if you've experienced it, people have experienced it. I do think, having seen these stock tick of cases and hospitalizations and deaths, it's our civic responsibility and duty now, which is ridiculous to say, but to recontextualize this disease, because this virus, because the vast majority of people have no symptoms or mild symptoms. That's the reality. And again, disclaimer, because you have to do a disclaimer, there are severe cases for other people too, and even deaths. We know that. It's not taking away from that. But for the vast majority of healthy, fit individuals, young people, this virus generally poses very minimal risk. And again, disclaimer, again, for all the fact checkers and all the trolls who are just waiting to try and get me blocked and banned. Yes, there is always exceptions. I know. Yeah, we shouldn't have to live in a world where we have to make disclaimers for the exceptions to the rule. But it's very tough. And again, I do know people in my network, young people who have been within that exception group. The argument I've made throughout this entire podcast, over 300 episodes, is that you've got the virus on one hand, and then you've got the response to the virus on the other. And you can treat each of them seriously. Your ability to your choice to assess COVID-19 or SARS-CoV-2 is separate from your ability to assess the draconian authoritarian policies that we've witnessed in response to COVID-19. There's no, in my view, there's no way a respiratory virus should lead to the erosion of liberties, human rights, and democracy. We've seen collectivism slide into authoritarianism, and a tyrannical form at that. Seeing the military on the streets in Australia right now, where they've had one death in 2021 from COVID-19 or with COVID-19, is exceptional. Yeah, how are we beginning to tolerate this? So here I am, potentially with COVID-19, standing firm in the fact that we can take COVID-19 seriously, but we should take the response to COVID-19 even more seriously, because that is a greater threat to humanity than this virus is. And I strongly believe that we have to come together to challenge what we're witnessing happening around the world, because what we permit, we promote. And what we're seeing in Australia right now, I believe, is a warning sign to the rest of the world. And we've seen this slide into medical tyranny, and it's growing, and the mindset is growing. That the money being spent on propaganda is outrageous. It's unbelievable to see. So we can take the virus on one hand and look at how we assess the risks of that thing, but we can also take the response. And just because there's plenty of people who are afraid of the virus still, but they're still challenging policy. They're not mutually exclusive. We need to move away from that, right? So again, your views or your own interpretation of risk from the virus is down to you. Now, for me, it's probably just a cold. It's probably just going to have minor cold-like symptoms. I know a couple other people recently who have tested positive, and they've also had very mild cold-like symptoms, which is odd because that seems to be a function of the Delta variant. But in many ways, that's a very positive news, because the reality is, if this thing, as it becomes endemic, becomes less severe, then, well, we should allow this thing. I can't say this live because I'll get censored, but you can guess what I'm about to say. I literally cannot say anything about circulating viruses without getting censored on Facebook. I had to stop myself, which comes back to the point around tyranny. Isn't it ridiculous that I can't talk about strategies for herd immunity on a podcast in 2021 on social media? It's ridiculous. Now, I'm on some platforms where I can say those things, but Facebook, YouTube, I can't talk about circulating viruses without getting censored. I can't indicate that there is benefit from allowing a virus to circulate without getting censored. Now, I personally believe if I have got COVID right now, then that's a major win. It's another person that's got immunity. And again, I can probably get censored for talking about natural immunity and the fact that there are multiple papers that show that the natural immunity is superior to the immunity that comes from medical interventions. We've known that for a long time. The early papers have shown strong both T cell and natural immune responses to the virus. There's studies from some of the nurses and doctors who were exposed early on in 2020, still showing strong antibody and T cell immunity. So we have to be able to get into the mindset that it's okay to develop. It's not actually just okay. It should be sought after that the young and healthy have the capability to develop acquire natural immunity, which is potentially going to outlast that of any medical intervention. We've seen the waning of the Pfizer jabs. So it's just we have to be clear that there are different ways to tackle this thing. So I mentioned about censorship. Well, on Friday, I went on a political rant around the segregation and discrimination that is occurring off the back of the vaccine passports. I went through the details of the vaccine passport rollout in Britain, in England specifically, talking about some of the millions that have been spent on the contracts, and the probable end result of this passport system, which is discriminatory in nature, leading to segregation. And I went on a bit of a tirade during my Friday session, having laid out the facts of all the different contracts, the numbers, etc. Went on a bit of a political statement. And as a result of that, I was not only censored on YouTube for that broadcast, but deplatformed completely. The Pandemic Podcast, having reached over 1 million people on YouTube, nearly 20,000 subscribers, was just taken off like that for one. It was termed. Apparently, I'd contravened their community guidelines with medical misinformation. The reality was it was a political statement I was making. So censored for making a political statement on YouTube. I'm now broadcasting to my personal YouTube channel. I'll be sending out the links to those for those who want to follow. And maybe there's an opportunity to rebrand at this point. By all definitions, there are very few places in the world now that you could say are within a pandemic stage of the viral evolution. So it's important to look at this as an opportunity to take a different stock. We recently hosted the Lockdown Summit with Question Everything, which was a really high level production. You can now see on the YouTube channel for Question Everything. Some of the videos are now available. Some of the individual talks, they'll all be available this week. If you haven't seen those, you can register at questioneverything.io. Where we actually went through a very academic overview of the response to COVID-19, critically evaluating policy, but also exploring solutions. So on one hand, I want to keep up that high level, very professional academic response, but then I also want to unleash the activist Stan, who wears things like Stand for Freedom t-shirts on his podcast, because that enables me to have those political rants whilst also having the more academic, scientific discussions in a very professional way. So I try and bridge those two gaps between providing credible information that you can trust on the podcast, that's been very well researched, fact-checked, credible experts coming to the forefront, particularly when there's so much misinformation and disinformation on every side, trying to bring a really balanced sense-making approach to everything relating to the virus and the response to the virus. But nonetheless, what we're experiencing right now has led to me to taking on the identity of an activist, and I've embraced activism full throttle since last year, because I do believe that our civil liberties are under threat, and I do believe our human rights are eroding in front of us, and democracy is being challenged. And it's really important now that we we take a stand, because there is no way that a virus should lead to the erosion of our liberties, rights, and democracy. And these things must be preserved. And I do believe that we've seen this rise of collectivism that has descended into totalitarianism, a very kind of fundamental left-wing authoritarianism that has come out of this. You know, there are plenty of people who can get behind the message of protecting one another, or the NHS or whatnot, save lives. You know, this messaging that's being bombarded. People can get behind that messaging out of the desire to do social good. But when that social good gets hijacked to the point where we see these individual and collective rights and freedoms challenged, then we must raise the alarm. And we've been doing that on the Pandemic Podcast now for over 12 months. Excuse me a second. Definitely feeling a little bit rough. But we can't just sit on the sidelines and allow this to happen. You know, we have to, for those who want to live in a free and open society, we must stand together in order to do that. So it's down to us to make that change. So again, you can take the situation around the virus seriously, but we can also take what's happening in the world around us seriously, because what we're seeing right now is the rise of a totalitarian, technocratic system that is placing our liberties, our rights, and democracy under threat, and we cannot watch that erode. So now is time for the summer of freedom. It's time for us to reclaim and restore and uphold the long-held values of freedom, of liberty, of our human rights, and make sure that this virus does not become the downfall of society as we know it. So for those of you who honor and respect a free and open society, it's our time. It's our time. Now, whilst I may be taking a couple of days off to recuperate, believe me, when I'm fully recharged, I'm ready to take this thing on like never before. My baby is due on the 1st of September. It gives a very clear window to do everything I possibly can to help drive this movement forward, so that we can fight for our freedoms and start to imagine and visualize a better world that balances individual rights and freedoms with the collective interests of society and the planet we live in. We shouldn't look at either or situations. If we live in an abundant, loving world, then we don't separate night and day. We don't separate our arms from our legs. Individualism and collectivism coexist. They're a part of the same one and all. You know, there is no separation. It's just when we get excess collectivism or excess individualism, we have a problem. So right now, we cannot allow the slide into collectivism, into totalitarianism, to be the thing that undermines a free and open society. We've seen, I don't even know if there's a term for it, but it feels like a global dictatorship when you've got such vast censorship, deplatforming of content like I've experienced, censorship of dissenting voices or alternative perspectives, the terming of science as the science. There is no such thing as the science. Science is always evolving. So we've seen this bizarre turning upside down of society and the world as we know it, and the vast majority have not been able to see it because they've been held captive in fear. And really, we're all victims in that. So it's time for us to become empowered. It's time for us to take a stand. And it's time for us to reclaim our freedoms. So I'm going to say goodnight for now. I may or may not be broadcasting tomorrow. I am going to be resting up, taking care of myself, making sure I'm fit and well. Lizzie's fine. My wife is fine. She's showing no symptoms of anything. So just steering away from her for the minute because I don't want her or the baby to get sick. So just doing the right thing. That's what we always have done, isn't it? Or we always should have done is if we get sick, we rest, we recover, we crack on. Simple message. I'll probably get censored for saying that, which again is just reflective of the crazy world we live in. All right. Good night. I'll see you all soon. Rest well and peace. Peace and love.